I'm Jonathan Spalding. I'm a certified service technician here at Redline Equipment, and today we're going to go over some of the finer points of a combine inspection. Today we got behind us a Class 8 flagship 250 series machine, and we're going to go over the benefits of having it inspected every year by a certified Case IH mechanic to minimize downtime and maximize productivity in the field. We're going to go over a few of the more critical areas to look over when you're checking out your combine, and those are going to be your feeder house, your threshing, your residue handling, your clean grain area, and your drivetrain. New for model year 19, Case came up with these heavier cast slats, and they have a little bumper underneath where it helps when it goes over the drum, so it doesn't actually get the chain to roll and flat spot on the back side of the link, so that helped out. And they also updated the faceplate pivot to a heavier design where we had trouble with the other ones breaking bolts and bolts coming out. Now they got this new heavy pivot design with a heavier pin going through it to help keep the faceplate attached to the feeder house. Now we're going to move around to the side of the feeder house and show you the updated tensioner springs for the feeder chain. For model year 19, they came out with this new heavier style feeder chain tensioner spring. That really helps out with the chain life, where some guys were having to replace chains after every season. Now we're getting 2, 3, 4 seasons out of them. So new heavier spring, they went back to an eyelet style bolt, tensioner bolt. That way it actually travels in the feeder house slot better than the previous ones were. Another point that we like to inspect and look at when we're doing these combine inspections is the poly piece in between the faceplate and the feeder house frame itself. A lot of guys take that for granted and complain about the faceplate pivoting slow whenever they have a head on, and a lot of times it's because this poly piece is worn out inside there. Now we're going to move back to the new design that they came out with in model year 19 for the feeder house drive gearbox. A lot of you that have had flagship machines before have had issues where you've stripped the splines out of the beater and the top sprocket, and for model year 19 they came out with a different, more robust design. They went from a 540 PTO to a 1000 spline drive, and instead of having to replace the whole top sprocket and beater like before, you can now just replace either the shaft in the gearbox or the drive coupler in the top sprocket or beater, which made it a lot better for you and us when we come out to actually make the repair. That way it's not as time consuming and we don't have to take so many parts off. Now I'm going to move on down to the feeder floor. On the older flagships, we had problems with the rear sheet. It wasn't aligned properly, so it would wear out and you ended up with a hole. On the 50 series combines, we now have a 2-piece feeder floor design where you don't have to try and piece 3 pieces of flooring together and you get bumps and ridges and stuff like that. So now we have more of a smooth flow in and a lot less wear on the feeder floor to cause issues with that. Now we're going to talk about the plastic guides that the feeder chain rides over inside the feeder house. So we're going to talk about these plastic skids underneath the feeder chain. It's kind of there to keep your chain from slapping on the cross member for your feeder frame. So a lot of times when the chain gets loose, you want to really double check and make sure that they're not worn out. Otherwise, it will cut your cross member support in half, and then that's just not good for anybody. So, you always want to make sure that you keep those. If you're lucky and you can get them popped out, you can reverse them, but a lot of times it's just easiest just to break them out and replace them as necessary. So we're going to go ahead and move back to the stripper plates on the top sprocket. Up here at the top sprocket, you have stripper plates that keep all the husk and silks and everything else away from your sprocket to keep them from wrapping up. So we'll always look at those and make sure that they're actually adjusted properly, but not too close, so they're not rubbing on the top sprocket and creating a fire hazard. So you definitely want to look at those, and then also look at your top sprocket and make sure that the teeth aren't cupped on it, causing the chain to actually jump over or jump a tooth and cause a lot of noise and vibration in the feeder house. We're going to jump from the top sprocket to the actual beater itself, and What we're looking at for on this is make sure that the splines aren't worn and you got a lot of free travel in the beater itself versus the gearbox, and you want to make sure that the bars aren't rounded enough to where they're not grabbing and actually knocking stuff down. Make sure there's not a lot of damage from rocks and other debris that get picked up while you're harvesting. They do offer a serrated style blade if you have a lot of green stem beans or material that doesn't feed like you think it should, to actually grab and help pull it through. Now that we've talked about the beater bars and their job, for the model year 19 combines and newer, they actually installed a grease hole for you to use while greasing the splines and the slip clutch for the beater itself and the top sprocket. And then, as you can see on this combine here, the seal's gotten ate up for the feeder house pivot, so it needs to be adjusted down just a tick to make sure that you don't have crop material and dust and everything blowing back out on top of the feeder house, causing you to not, be able to see stuff in your feeder house from pivoting properly. Now that we're done talking about the feeder house, we're going to move around to the side of the combine and talk about concaves, rasp bars, and final drives. So normally what we look at for on the rasp bars is you'll see on the end of the bolt that it has a number stamped, actually raised numbers on the end of it. And normally once those start to wear off and you can't read the numbers, that's the hardened part of the bolt, and that means that now you're into the softer metal, so it's going to wear twice as fast as what it normally would have to begin with. So the concaves, this customer has round bars in it because he was shelling corn last, so usually don't have too much damage on those unless he miraculously picked up a rock while shelling corn. But normally you want to feel on the back side of those and make sure they're still round and actually able to around instead of just kind of tumble around and break the cob, and therefore we got a little more material to re-thresh and get separated. Now that we've talked about the inside of the combine, the rotor, the rasp bars, the concaves, we're also going to talk about the Concaves Carrier, as the front left corner usually gets a lot of the wear and damage and tends to wear off and create a gap, letting unthreshed material fall out onto the grain pan and get you an unclean sample. So now that we've talked about that, we're going to move on to the vertical auger and talk about what we look for while we're looking at that. Now we're going to talk about the vertical auger. What we look for when we're checking those out is we're looking for slop from the auger itself to the gearbox, making sure that the splines aren't getting worn, and then we also check the flighting on the auger to make sure it's not sharp or starting to fold over, and therefore not causing any issues with carrying the grain up to the unloading auger itself. Move back here to the chopper portion of the combine. What we normally look at here is we want to check and make sure the chopper bearings aren't getting hot when it's running or failing, because that's a big fire hazard. We also like to make sure that we can shift the rotor from high speed to low speed. I suggest doing that whenever you're greasing the machine or looking it over every morning. Just go ahead and shift it back and forth just to make sure that it actually does move, because they do get stuck in position. Also, we like to make sure that the chopper tensioner pulleys are free on the shaft. Sometimes they get stuck and cause the belts to actually slip and not turn the rotor, so therefore you'll get an alarm stating that you have low chopper speed. Next we'll move back here to the spreader and the sieve area. As you can see back here in the spreader area, we got the windrow door open so we can look in and see the stationary knives and the chopper knives, make sure they're not missing or just worn out to where we need to flip or actually replace. Also back here we look at the spreader motors and make sure that they're not leaking or missing, and we check out the whale's tail, the divider in between the two spreaders, make sure it's not cracked or falling off. That has happened before, so like I said, just kind of check all that stuff out and make sure it's not damaged in any way possible. While back here in this corner also, we like to check and make sure that the pre-sieve adjustment rod is free and moves and is not broken, as they tend to fall off. On the back side of the clean grain elevator, you have a drive chain and a drive belt, so you can change from high speed to low speed. Whatever crop you're harvesting, you can change the speed of the elevator in which it brings the crop into the grain tank. So you want to double check the chain's not worn out or stretched too far, and that the sprockets aren't cupped and causing any issues there. Same thing with the drive belt. We'll make sure it's not cracked and the bearings and the pulleys aren't failing as well. So move from the clean grain elevator to the tailings housing. What we check for back here is none of the drive pulleys or the drive belt has come off, and none of the bearings on the actual paddles themselves are failing or getting hot. And we also like to double check and make sure that the tailings housing where it's mounted to the combine frame is not cracked. We had an issue with that for a while, and it was causing a lot of flex, and it would crack and actually just fall off of the combine. So you want to double check and make sure you look at all that stuff back there. Also back here in the corner, you want to look at and make sure that the rotary air screen is moving and sucking all the dirt and debris off. So you want to make sure that the drive belt for it's not broken, or if it's a hydraulic version, then you want to make sure that the hydraulics are working for it as well. Just to recap what we've went over today in this video, we went over the feeder house area, the threshing area, the residue handling area, the clean grain, and the drivetrain. In conclusion today, we want to thank you guys for taking the time to do this brief walk around with us, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you need any parts or service, we look forward to seeing you at your local Redline equipment dealer. Thank you.